Hey everybody, this is Jason, your host of World History for You. Today, we're going to look at a very interesting topic. So we're going to look at Southernization as an introduction to the world system before Europeans arrive in it. Okay, so we're looking at the period from about 1200 to around 1450 today, right? Very fascinating period in time. Like I said, this is looking at the world before the arrival of Europeans into the system, right? So we can look at what the world looks like before Europeans bring in Christianity and this kind of proto-capitalism they'll bring in, and colonialism too, right? So we think about this concept of the Great Divergence, right? That's what we talked about in the last video. Well, if we're going to think about divergence, we have to know what was happening before there was a divergence, right? So the importance of looking at the world before Europe shows up, it's really crucial, right? To look at the difference between a post-European world and a pre-European world, right? It's a very different world, okay? The center of the Eastern Hemisphere at that time is not centered around Europe, right? It's actually centered around the Indian Ocean, okay? So as we think about this, I like to suggest texts. One of the more important texts that deals with this period is Janet Abu Lughod's Before European Hegemony. We talked about this a little bit last time. Okay? And if you'll remember, what she does is take Emanuel Wallerstein's concept of a world system and just push it back in time. Right? Wallerstein says we get a full world system once both hemispheres of the world are connected. Right? But then you have scholars like Abu Lughod who say, well, that's true, but we can take the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere on their own and see how they function as a system, right? So really important book. There's been a ton of research since the book came out as well to back up her conclusions too, okay? But for our purposes today, we're going to use something a little bit shorter, okay? This is an essay by Lynda Shaffer called Southernization, okay? And the title hints at what she's getting at here, right? She's got this idea that in this period from 1200 to 1450, you have a concept that's analogous to Westernization, right? And Westernization basically means when Europe starts to enter the world system, they're bringing their Western values, they're bringing their Western modes of production, their economic system, etc., to the rest of the world, right? And they will have this quite profound impact on how the world functions, okay? Well, she says that if you go back far enough, right, to, the Middle Ages, essentially, 1200 to 1450 or so, you have something else happening here that she calls Southernization, where you have the southern parts of the world being the influential regions of the world, right? You'll see values from the southern part of the world spreading around, right? Economic models spreading around, etc. Okay? So again, this is analogous to that later concept of Westernization, right? Now, what she's going to do here is quite interesting. So she'll kind of split this up into three regions that she'll focus on, okay? And if we look at this on the map, you can see them, right? There's a great map from Eric Ross here, a geographer, where he shows you these core regions, the goods that they're producing, and the trade networks that are connecting them, okay? So right there in the middle, we've got South Asia, right, the Indian subcontinent. To the east, we've got East Asia, China, right? And then to the west, we've got the Islamic world, okay? And what she does in Southernization is take a look at how each of these three regions has this southernizing impact on the Eastern Hemisphere, right? Again, analogous to that later concept of Westernization, right? Now, where she's going to start is right in the middle, right, with the Indian subcontinent, okay? And again, if you look at it on the map, it's kind of centered there, right? Right in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They're kind of the center of the activity in between the Islamic world and in between China, okay? And something we want to point out is this is a very interesting development in terms of the environment too, because a lot of this is based on interactions with the environment, okay? Trade in the Indian Ocean is based on dry versus monsoon seasons, right? So you get these seasons where the winds are blowing one direction, and other seasons where they're blowing in another direction, right? So as you sail westward, for example, and you land in one of these port cities, you're going to have to stay there for a couple of months until the wind changes direction and can bring you back home. Okay? And what you have developing are these very vibrant kind of international port cities, right? People from all over the place are living here. So you've got different religions butting up against each other, different languages, etc. Right? It's a really quite fascinating development in world history where you have these kind of mini diasporas happening in these port cities, right? And all these different people bumping up against each other, right? And obviously, India is going to kind of be the center of that. So a lot of these coastal cities in India are very international in scope. Okay. Now, once she gets into the concept of Southernization with India, right? What does India have that's going to influence the rest of the world? Well, number one is going to be its textiles. Okay. The influence of Indian cotton is huge in world history. Okay. And this goes back thousands of years even. Right? They found evidence of Indian textiles in Egypt. Okay, and this is because South Asians, the people of the Indian subcontinent, are really good at this. Okay, in terms of growing cotton, and in terms of turning it into a finished product. Okay, they've kind of mastered this skill, and to the point that these become global goods. People want these Indian textiles, right? And they're beautiful, right? They have these wonderful block prints, they're batik prints, etc. Right? They've gotten really good at designing a beautiful textile here. Okay, and they're going to remain the dominant cotton textile manufacturer until the 1800s. Okay, until the British develop their industrial system and will eventually supplant the Indians as being the kind of global producer of these cotton goods. Okay? So cotton textiles, very, very important. And we're going to come back to that. We'll do some more work on this. Okay? Another important development in India is crystallized sugar. Okay? This is where historians have through their research, cited this is basically where this technology came out of, right? The ability to kind of dehydrate sugar so that you can pack it and ship it around the world, right? If you know anything about sugar cane, once you cut the cane down, you don't have very long before it basically turns into an alcohol. So being able to take the liquid out, dehydrate it, turn it into this crystallized product is quite revolutionary. And as we know, sugar is ubiquitous in the world today, right? This form of crystallized sugar. Okay? It will have consequences, though. Okay? And we'll come back to that when we talk about the Islamic world. Okay? And then lastly, she also talks about the kind of intellectual developments on the Indian subcontinent, especially their mathematics and their use of astronomy. Right? She brings up the concept of zero, right, and how influential that will be on the world. Right? We kind of take that for granted today. But the Islamic world, China, Europe, they'll all pick up on this zero and be able to use that in some very complex mathematics, engineering, etc. Okay. So again, India, quite important in this role of Southernization, right? A couple of products, remember, cotton and sugar, right? Those are going to be these global products that we'll keep coming back to in the future as being very, very important in the development of world history. Okay? All right, so next, she's going to turn to China. Okay? And she takes an interesting approach here. One, she's going to look at how China is affected by Southernization itself, and then she'll take a look at how China will affect the rest of the world. Okay, so her first discussion is this Southernization of China itself, where she focuses on two primary developments. One, the introduction of Buddhism to China. Right, that's going to come from its southern neighbors in India and Nepal. Right, and it's going to make its way into China through the Silk Roads primarily. Right? Some through maritime routes as well. Okay. This will be an interesting development in Chinese history. Okay, before the introduction of Buddhism, you have some other kind of philosophical ideas in China. You've got Confucianism, and you've got Taoism. Okay, and these will all become at different times in Chinese history competing ideas, but then at other times they'll become syncretic ideas, where you'll see elements of each of these kind of blending together. Okay. This will have a pretty huge impact on China. Right? Another thing she talks about in terms of southernizing China is agricultural developments. Okay, they're going to bring in a new type of rice from another southern neighbor, from what's today called Vietnam. Okay, this champa rice that they bring into China is hugely, hugely impactful. Okay, it is a crop that you can get 2 to 3 harvests out of a year. Okay, so that's producing more food for your population, which means your population can grow, your economy can grow, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, eventually this will lead to the doubling of the Chinese population. Right, so it's very, very big development, and something that's done very intentionally. Okay, to bring in this new rice to improve agricultural production. Okay? Now, if we look at China as a whole and how it's influencing the rest of the world, very, very large impacts. Okay. And Shaffer has an interesting source in here from Francis Bacon, where he says that basically there's 3 inventions that really change world history. Okay? He brings up the compass, he brings up gunpowder, and he brings up the printing press, all coming out of China. Okay. And Bacon acknowledges that, right? It's hard to downplay the impact of these 3 technologies. And again, when Europe ventures out into the world, gunpowder and the compass are going to be very important to them. Okay. Now, the final discussion she has here is with the Islamic world. Okay. And Islamic world is to the west, right? But they're very heavily involved in these trade routes. These Islamic merchants are moving a lot of goods throughout the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Right? And as they're doing that, they're bringing Islam with them as well. Right? So you see the spread of Islam as these Islamic merchants are moving around the world system. Right? So much so that you end up with mosques in China, you end up with mosques in Southeast Asia, in India, East Africa, etc. Right? So again, you've got this Southernization happening, right? This Islamic religion making its way through the rest of the world. Okay. And as I said, we'll come back to sugar, right? The Islamic world will pick up on sugar as well, right? They're going to take it from South Asia, from India, bring it into the Middle East, to North Africa, and eventually into the Islamic parts of Western Europe, to Al-Andalusia, which is Portugal and Spain today. Okay. Now, there are consequences that come with sugar, right? This is going to be one of those global products that we come back to again and again, right? For the Islamic world, they don't want to grow the sugarcane themselves, right? It's a very labor-intensive process. It's not an easy crop, okay? So they turn to enslaved labor to do this, okay? Which is something the Europeans are going to pick up on in the future, right? However, there's a problem with this, right? People don't want to do labor when they're forced into it. Nobody wants to be a slave, right? So you end up with this resistance movement that will not go away in the Islamic world, right? So this is primarily happening in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. And you end up with this almost constant revolt that turns into what we call the Zanj revolt, which lasts for around 12 years. And the enslaved people are successful. And that pretty much puts an end to this plantation system of growing sugar in the Islamic world. Okay? That's not to say that slavery will end in the Islamic world. You're still going to have domestic slavery and other forms of slavery, but this kind of super intensive agricultural labor system will be pretty much abandoned right after these slave revolts. Europeans are going to have to learn that lesson too, right? As they start to colonize South America and the Caribbean, they're going to try to do the same thing. Right? They're going to set up these massive sugar plantations based on enslaved labor from West Africa. However, same thing happens, right? These people do not want to be enslaved. You're going to have a constant resistance and struggle against slavery that the European powers just cannot put down, right? It gets to the point that it's unsustainable, right? Where they cannot keep this going, okay? And these revolts lead to emancipation in the Americas as well, okay? Last thing to say about the Islamic world is they'll also adopt the concept of zero in Indian mathematics as well. And we'll get things like algebra from this, okay? And we'll get some really interesting use of geometry from this. If you look at Islamic architecture, for example, it's absolutely gorgeous with its geometric patterns. You look at the Alhambra Mosque in Spain. The geometry there is just incredible, right? Look at the mosque in Iran. It's mind blowing that this was accomplished. I mean, these are really, really amazing architectural pieces. Okay? Now, having said that, right, we've got India, China, and the Islamic world that Shaffer's focusing on here as the southernizing regions, right? Now, she's not so much focusing on this as a world system, so to speak, but that's what's happening here, right? What she's focusing on are what we would call the core regions of the world, right? She says these are our three core regions. They're producing luxury goods, right? They have surplus wealth in their societies, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and thinking about this from world system, that means there's peripheries too, right? There are other regions that are supplying raw materials to the core, right? Supplying labor to the core. Okay, they're not necessarily producing luxury goods, right? Some of the people in periphery may be buying these luxury goods, but they're not so much producing these finished luxury goods. So we're talking about supplying lumber to the world system, perhaps ivory, minerals, gold, these kind of things that are just as important, right? But they're not what we call like finished goods. Okay, and that's something we'll come back to as well, right? How are the peripheries interacting with the cores? What's going on there? Okay. One more thing I want to be sure to get in here too is the role of government, right, and making this system function, right, and making these trade networks flourish. Okay, that's something that we cannot discount, right? You have governments who are actively participating in this through things like infrastructure projects, right? In China, for example, they're going to build the Grand Canal to connect southern China to northern China, so you can move people and goods from north to south, right? You'll see governments all around the world engaging in road building, right? Setting up standardized currencies, setting up systems of weights and measurements, all these things to make trade easier, okay? And again, in China, you even have the role of the government in the production of porcelain itself, right? They're financing some of this, they're overseeing it, etc., right? So that's something that we can't leave out either is the role of government in helping this to function too, okay? So again, to wrap up, right? We've got some big concepts here today. Okay? Number one, when we're looking at this world from 1200 to 1450, we have to think of this as the pre-European world, right? Europe is on the periphery here, okay? They're not in the center of the action, but that's what they want to get to in that next time period from 1450 to 1750, right? So when we look at this world, this is the world that Europe is trying to get access to, right? But, they're pretty far away, okay? And when luxury goods do make it to Europe, they're quite expensive, right? Because they've had to go through middleman after middleman after middleman to make it there, okay? So again, once we get to that next time period, that's what they're trying to get to. They're trying to get to this world that Lynda Shaffer is talking about and Janet Abu Lughod is talking about, right? This very vibrant world system where trade and exchange is flourishing, okay? Now, what we'll do in the following videos is we'll dig a little bit deeper into this, right? We'll look at the kind of regional developments in the world system and how some of these different regions are connected to the other regions, right? How are the cores interacting with each other? How are the cores interacting with the peripheries, etc., right? So, like I said, following videos, we'll give you some examples of these things, and we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into what's happening in these different regions, okay? All right, so I appreciate you guys joining us today. Like I said, watch the following videos to get a little more in-depth on what we're talking about today. All right, so again, appreciate you guys. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you share, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody. Hey, you. Thanks for watching World History for You. Please subscribe and share with your friends. We'll see you next time.